Have you ever stopped to realize that there is a voice inside your head? It's always talking, judging, reminiscing about the past, or worrying about the future. But here's the big question: that voice is not you. Most people live identified with their mind, believing that their thoughts define who they are. But what if I told you that this was the biggest illusion of your existence? Philosopher and spiritual master Eckhart Tolle revolutionized the way we understand the human mind by revealing that our suffering comes from identifying with our thoughts. When we believe that we are our mind, we become its prisoners, hostages to anxieties, fears, and pains that are actually just mental creations. In this video, you will understand why you are not your mind, how it controls your life without you realizing it, and most importantly, how to break free from this cycle to awaken your true consciousness. Stay until the end, because we're going to explore powerful teachings by Eckhart Tolle and techniques for you to stop being dominated by the mind and experience a state of deep presence. Now let's get to the first point. Why aren't you your mind? From birth, we are conditioned to believe that our mind defines who we are. We build an identity based on thoughts, memories, beliefs, and opinions. We say things like, "I'm anxious," "I'm a failure," or "I'm a success," without realizing that all these statements are just concepts created by the mind. But are you really that voice that speaks inside your head all the time? Eckhart Tolle teaches us that this identification with thoughts is the great illusion that keeps us trapped in suffering. We confuse our essence with the incessant flow of ideas that appear and disappear in our mind without noticing that there is something greater and deeper within us. What happens when you disconnect from these thoughts? Do you cease to exist? Of course not. This proves that you are not your mind, but the consciousness behind it. The mind is like an extremely powerful tool, but when used without control, it becomes a tyrannical master. Imagine a hammer. It's useful for nailing a nail, but it would be absurd to carry it around in your hand all the time for no reason. Yet that's exactly how we use our minds. We think compulsively without rest, even when there is no real need. This addiction to thinking keeps us trapped in cycles of anxiety and suffering because the mind is rarely in the present. It lives in the past, reliving pain and regrets, or in the future, creating scenarios of fear and worry. The ego, a central concept in Tolle's teachings, is responsible for this false identity. It is built on the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. But these stories are just interpretations, often distorted, based on past experiences and future projections. When we blindly believe them, we become hostages to the ego and its traps. If someone criticizes you, for example, the ego immediately reacts with defensiveness or anger because it sees this criticism as a threat to the identity you have built. But if you look more closely, you'll see that this identity is nothing more than a mental narrative. This identification with the mind prevents us from experiencing true peace. Have you ever noticed how moments of deep silence bring a sense of relief? This is because, in these moments, you disconnect from the incessant activity of the mind and get in touch with something deeper, pure consciousness. Tolle teaches us that it is possible to live this way more often, but to do so we must first recognize the illusion of mental identity. Take a test right now, close your eyes for a few seconds and try to observe your thoughts. Don't try to control them, just watch them appear and disappear. Realize that there is something inside you that observes these thoughts without being confused with them. That part that observes is your true essence. You are not the thought that says, "I am insufficient" or "I am an incredible person." You are the one who notices these thoughts arise and disappear. This is the first step towards liberation, understanding that the mind is just a mechanism, not your identity. If there's one thing that keeps millions of people stuck in suffering, it's the belief that their thoughts are the absolute truth. Have you ever found yourself reliving a painful moment from the past over and over again, as if you were trying to change something that has already happened? Or imagining scenarios of failure and rejection before they even happen? That's the mind's trap. It creates stories that seem real, but which, more often than not, are just projections. Eckhart Tolle teaches that suffering arises from identifying with thoughts. In other words, when we believe that the voice inside our head defines who we are, we fall into a cycle of emotional pain that never ends. The ego, which is this false identity built up throughout life, feeds on this suffering in order to continue existing. It creates a narrative of me against the world, reinforcing feelings of inferiority, pride, fear, and anger. But where does this need for suffering come from? The ego needs a sense of identity in order to survive, and one of the most effective ways of strengthening this identity is through pain. It sounds strange, but many people cling to suffering because it somehow makes them feel that they are someone. Phrases like, "I'm an unlucky person," "I'll never be loved," "I'm a failure," or even "nobody understands me," create a victim story that gives the ego a purpose. It feeds on this role because without it, its existence is threatened. Now think about this. How many times has your mind predicted a disaster that never happened? How many times have you lost hours of sleep anticipating a problem that in the end resolved itself? The ego holds you prisoner to a psychological time that doesn't exist, the past and the future. The past is full of guilt, regret, and resentment, while the future is full of anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. But the present, the only moment that really exists, is constantly ignored. Tolle teaches us that this identification with thoughts creates an accumulated emotional pain, which he calls the pain body. This pain body is like a mental parasite that grows stronger every time we let ourselves be carried away by negative emotions. That's why sometimes a small criticism can make us feel a disproportionate weight, as if all our value is being attacked. The pain body looks for new reasons to exist, and the more we feed it destructive thoughts, the more we identify with this false idea of who we are. The way out of this cycle lies in perception. The first step to freeing yourself from suffering is to become aware that it exists. When you notice that your mind is creating unnecessary drama, stop for a moment and ask yourself, who is observing this thought? You will begin to notice that there is a part of you that can witness these thoughts without being carried away by them. That part is pure awareness, your true identity, which doesn't need suffering to exist. Practicing this awareness is what leads to awakening. Suffering only has power over you as long as you blindly believe in it. The moment you become observant without judging or reacting, it loses its power. If you stop for a moment and pay attention, you'll realize that there's a voice inside your head that never shuts up. It comments on everything, judges the people around you, relives situations from the past, worries about the future, and often creates stories that aren't even real. The scariest thing, most people spend their entire lives listening to this voice without questioning it, believing it to be who they really are. Eckhart Tolle teaches that this incessant voice of the mind is just a stream of automatic thoughts, but we identify with them so much that we can't see the separation between who we are and what we think. And that's where the problem begins. If you believe you are that voice, then you will be dragged down by all the emotions it generates: anxiety, fear, frustration, guilt, regret. But if you learn to observe your thoughts without identifying with them, you can find a state of peace that few people know. The mind works like a radio that is always on, but you rarely choose the station. It speaks all the time without your permission. Now think, who is listening to that voice? There is something inside you that is aware of your own thoughts. This something is your true essence. The part of you that can observe your mind in action without being sucked in by it. Tolle calls this capacity witness consciousness, and developing it is the first step to getting out of mental prison. But how do you do that? The first step is simply to notice your thoughts instead of getting lost in them. Take the test now. Close your eyes for a few seconds and observe what pops into your mind. Don't try to control it, just notice it. Maybe a thought pops up saying, "This isn't going to work," or "What am I going to eat later?" Just observe as if you were watching clouds passing across the sky. Realize that you are not those thoughts, you are the one who sees them. This simple practice already creates a separation between you and your mind. At first, it may seem difficult because the thoughts come so quickly and seem uncontrollable, but the more you practice, the more you realize that you can choose not to react to them. When a negative thought arises, instead of believing it, you can simply say, "Oh look, another thought," and let it go. This is liberating because it teaches us that we don't have to be slaves to the mind. You don't have to believe everything you think. Not every thought is true, and many of them are just old patterns that repeat themselves for no reason. When you learn to observe them without judgment, you begin to realize that most emotional suffering doesn't come from reality, but from the stories your mind tells about it. If you observe your mind, you will realize that it is rarely in the present moment. It is always revisiting the past, trying to resolve something that has already happened, or projecting the future, imagining scenarios that may never come true. And it is precisely this inability to remain in the now that generates anxiety, fear, and suffering. Eckhart Tolle teaches that the only moment that really exists is the present. The past is nothing more than memories stored in your mind, and the future is just a mental projection that hasn't yet come true. However, we spend most of our mental energy living in these two unreal times, completely ignoring the only moment where life happens, the now. But how exactly does this affect us? Think of the following example. Imagine you're sitting in a park, feeling the breeze on your face, listening to the birds, and watching the trees sway in the wind. The moment is perfect, but your mind keeps thinking about a meeting you have tomorrow or something someone said a few days ago. Although physically you're in the park, mentally you're somewhere else. This means that you're not really living in that moment. You're lost in your mind. The mind creates this illusion because it believes that the past and the future are essential to your identity. But what would happen if, for an instant, you stopped thinking and simply were present? A deep silence would overtake you, a space without worries, without judgments, without suffering. This space is your true nature. The secret to silencing the mind is not to fight it or try to force it to stop thinking. The secret is simply to come back to the now. Whenever you notice your mind racing to the past or the future, ask yourself, what is happening right now? Observe your breathing, feel the contact between your body and the chair, listen to the sounds around you. Do this with complete attention. This simple exercise creates a space between you and your mind. The more you practice, the more you realize that thoughts lose their hold on you. They still arise, but now you see them coming and going without clinging to them. This state of presence is what Tolle calls true awareness, a state where the mind loses its grip and you experience the deep peace of the present moment. Many people who have applied these teachings report impressive transformations. Anxiety and depression decrease, the feeling of lightness increases, and problems that seemed overwhelming are faced with more clarity and tranquility. This happens because when you live in the now, you realize that most problems exist only in your mind. If you are not your thoughts, your emotions, or your memories, then who are you? This is a profound question that can completely change your perception of life. For years, we have believed that our identity is linked to what we think and feel. But Eckhart Tolle teaches us that this is just an illusion created by the mind. There is something beyond that, something much deeper and truer. Most people live as prisoners of an identity constructed by the ego. The ego defines itself through labels. I'm a lawyer, I'm an anxious person, I'm a success, or I'm a failure. It creates a story based on the past and projects a future that reinforces this identity. But this whole narrative isn't you, it's just a set of repetitive thoughts that have accumulated over time. Now try the following experiment. For a moment, close your eyes and be completely silent. Don't try to think about anything, just feel your own presence. What's left when your thoughts disappear? Even for a few seconds, you still exist, right? This silent awareness, this presence that observes everything without judgment, is who you really are. Tolle teaches that true peace comes from recognizing this awareness. When you realize that you are something beyond the mind, suffering loses its grip on you. Thoughts still arise, but now you don't cling to them. Emotions arise, but you don't identify with them. Fear may arise, but you know that it is only a passing phenomenon within your experience. This awakening doesn't mean that you'll never have problems or challenges again. It means that you now look at them from a different perspective. Instead of reacting automatically, you observe. Instead of getting caught up in the drama of the mind, you stay anchored in present awareness. Life continues to happen, but your relationship to it changes completely. Tolle calls this state true presence. It's a state of deep connection with reality, where the mind loses its dominance, and you experience life more lightly and authentically. When you identify with the mind, any small setback becomes a gigantic problem. But when you are awakened to your true nature, you realize that much of the suffering was just a mind game. Now that we understand that we are not our thoughts, a new question arises: how do we live this awareness on a daily basis? Understanding that you are not your mind is the first step towards freedom, but the real transformation happens when you put this knowledge into practice. The mind has been trained for years to take control, create stories, and keep you trapped in a cycle of compulsive thoughts. That's why letting go of the mind doesn't happen overnight. It requires daily practice and awareness. Eckhart Tolle teaches that the secret to this change lies in cultivating presence in the now. Whenever you find yourself lost in thoughts about the past or worried about the future, make a conscious effort to bring your attention to the present. But how do you do this in practice? The first technique is mindfulness. Instead of fighting thoughts or trying to block them out, simply observe them neutrally. When a thought arises, ask yourself, do I really need to believe this? If it's a negative or fear-based thought, realize that it's just a passing mental phenomenon. The more you practice this observation, the more you realize that you don't have to react to everything your mind creates. Another powerful technique is to use your body as an anchor for the present. The mind lives in psychological time, but the body is always in the now. Whenever you feel like you're being dragged down by thoughts, focus on your breathing, the rhythm of your heart, or the sensation of your feet touching the ground. These small moments of mindfulness help to interrupt the incessant flow of the mind and bring you back to reality. Silence is also a great ally. The mind loves to be busy, consuming information all the time. But if you set aside moments in your day for silence and contemplation, you'll start to notice something surprising. The less mental noise, the more clarity and inner peace you experience. Another fundamental aspect is accepting the present moment. Suffering often arises from resistance to reality. The mind says, "This shouldn't be happening. My life should be different. I can't accept this." But the truth is that reality is already happening, regardless of what your mind thinks about it. When you deeply accept the now without fighting it, a state of natural peace arises. This doesn't mean that you'll never take action to change something, but it does mean that you'll do so from awareness, not resistance. Finally, practice emotional detachment. Negative emotions are strengthened by attachment to stories in the mind. If something bothers you, instead of getting lost in the mental drama, just try to feel the emotion without judging it. Watch it arise, reach its peak, and then disappear. The more you do this, the more you realize that emotions are just passing energies, not something that defines who you are. When these practices become a habit, something extraordinary happens. You begin to experience life with more lightness and clarity. The mind continues to exist, but now it is a tool under your control, and no longer a tyrannical master. True freedom lies not in changing the outside world, but in changing the way you relate to your own mind. Awakening is not a destination, but a path, and every time you choose presence over identification with the mind, you are taking another step on the journey towards true inner peace. The mind can be a great ally or your worst enemy. And the difference between these two realities lies in how you relate to it. Now that you understand that you are not your thoughts, that you can observe them without being dominated by them, and that the present is the only real moment. Now answer me in the comments. Which thought traps you the most on a daily basis? Anxiety about the future? Regret for the past? Or that critical voice that never shuts up? If this video helped you, please leave a like, because it shows us that this content made sense to you. And if you want to keep receiving powerful reflections like this, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications.